The afternoon sun blazed down on a busy Chicago street, casting long shadows on the pavement. People hurried by, immersed in their routines, their faces set with the intensity of modern life. Amid the hustle, a man sat on the corner, leaning against the brick wall of an old building. His clothes were tattered, his beard unkempt, and his eyes carried the weight of a life far removed from the bustling crowd. This was Leroy, a man whose past was a mystery to those who ignored him daily. The world around him moved in a blur, but Leroy seemed frozen in time, clutching a battered coffee cup that jingled with a few coins. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. As he scanned the crowd, his gaze fell upon a figure walking with a sense of purpose, radiating confidence and charm. Dressed casually but with an unmistakable aura, the man stood out. His tall frame, broad shoulders, and the trademark earring that glimmered in the sunlight revealed his identity to those who cared to look closely. Michael Jordan, the basketball legend, and one of the most famous athletes in the world. Leroy's eyes narrowed as he recognized Jordan. It wasn't every day you saw a global icon walking down your street. His instinct told him this was an opportunity, albeit a slim one. Gathering what courage he could muster, Leroy stood, brushed the dust off his frayed pants, and stepped into Jordan's path. The crowd seemed to part instinctively, giving Leroy an unintentional spotlight. "Hey man," Leroy called out, his voice gravelly from years of hardship. Jordan paused mid-step, his expression shifting to one of curiosity. He turned to face the man, his brow furrowing slightly. Leroy took a breath and with a nervous chuckle said, "Can you spare $1?" The question lingered in the air for a moment, as if the world itself had paused to listen. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been starker. Jordan, a man of unparalleled success and wealth, stood before Leroy, whose life had unraveled to the point of needing a single dollar. It was a snapshot of life's cruel disparities, a collision of worlds that rarely intersected. Jordan tilted his head, studying Leroy with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the surface. The crowd, sensing the moment, slowed their pace, some even stopping to watch the exchange. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Jordan's face before he responded, his deep voice cutting through the noise of the street. "Why do you need $1?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with curiosity. Leroy hesitated. He hadn't expected a follow-up question. Most people either ignored him or threw a few coins into his cup without a second thought. He shrugged, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I just need something to eat, man, that's all." Jordan nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. He reached into his pocket, and for a brief second Leroy's heart leapt, but instead of pulling out his wallet, Jordan crossed his arms and leaned slightly toward Leroy. "Let me ask you something," Jordan said. "If I gave you $1, what would you do tomorrow? Would you still be here, asking for another one?" The question caught Leroy off guard. It wasn't accusatory, but it carried a weight that made him shift uncomfortably. He opened his mouth to respond, but Jordan continued before he could. "You see," Jordan said, his voice steady and deliberate, $1 won't change your life. It might get you through today, but what about next week? Next month? What's your plan?" The crowd had grown larger now, people whispering among themselves, their eyes darting between Leroy and Jordan. Leroy felt the weight of their stares, the judgment in their eyes. He wanted to disappear, but there was something in Jordan's tone that held him in place. Something that felt less like a rebuke and more like an invitation to think deeper. I don't know," Leroy admitted, his voice barely audible. "I just need to get by, man." Jordan straightened, his expression softening slightly. "Getting by isn't living," he said. "I know what it's like to struggle. Maybe not the way you do, but I've been there. I've been doubted, pushed down, told I wasn't good enough. But I learned something important. No one's going to hand you a better life. You've got to take it." Leroy frowned, his confusion evident. "Easy for you to say," he muttered, gesturing toward Jordan's expensive sneakers and pristine watch. "You've got everything." Jordan smiled faintly, a trace of sadness in his eyes. "You think I was born with this? You think it came easy?" He shook his head. "I worked for every ounce of it. Every dunk, every championship, every endorsement. You know what that took? Sacrifice, discipline, belief." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Leroy saw something beyond the fame and fortune. He saw the man behind the legend, someone who understood struggle in his own way. Jordan reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a crisp $100 bill. The crowd gasped and Leroy's eyes widened, but before handing it over, Jordan leaned in close, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'll give you this," he said, holding the bill just out of reach. "On one condition, tomorrow you find a way to start something, anything, a plan, a job, a dream, whatever it is, make today the last day you beg for $1." Leroy stared at the bill, his mind racing. The temptation to snatch it and run was strong, but so was the weight of Jordan's words. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "I'll try," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll try." Jordan placed the bill in Leroy's hand and gave his shoulder a firm squeeze. "Don't try," he said. "Do." With that, Jordan walked away, his figure disappearing into the crowd as quickly as he had appeared. The spectators murmured among themselves, their conversations a mix of admiration and skepticism. Leroy stood there, clutching the $100 bill, feeling the eyes of the world on him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, he felt a spark of something he thought he had lost: hope. The following day, Leroy woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The memory of Jordan's words echoed in his mind as he walked the streets, searching for an opportunity. It wasn't easy. Doors were closed in his face, and people dismissed him as just another homeless man. But he persisted, fueled by the promise he had made to himself. Weeks turned into months, and Leroy's life began to change. He found work at a local diner, starting as a dishwasher and slowly earning the trust of his employer. With his first paycheck, he rented a small room and bought a set of clean clothes. The road was far from easy, but Leroy embraced the struggle, remembering Jordan's words each time he felt like giving up. One day, while cleaning tables during his break, Leroy caught sight of a television mounted on the wall. It was broadcasting a live interview with Michael Jordan. Leroy paused, the sound of Jordan's voice pulling him back to that fateful day. "People always ask me about success," Jordan was saying. "They think it's about talent or luck, but it's not. Success is about resilience. It's about what you do when no one's watching, when no one believes in you. It's about taking the first step, no matter how small." Leroy smiled, his chest swelling with a sense of pride. He knew he still had a long way to go, but he had taken that first step. And in that moment, he realized that Jordan had given him more than a $100 bill. He had given him a chance to believe in himself again. As the years passed, Leroy's life transformed in ways he never imagined. He became a manager at the diner, mentoring young employees and sharing his story of resilience and hope. He often thought about Jordan and the unlikely encounter that had changed his life. It was a moment that reminded him, and everyone who heard his story, that sometimes a single act of kindness, coupled with a challenge to rise above, could spark a lifetime of change. As Leroy stood in the glow of his small but newfound success, his story began to spread. It wasn't something he shouted from rooftops or paraded around. It was whispered among co-workers, shared by those who knew him, and eventually found its way into the broader world. The man who had once begged on the street corner was now a symbol of perseverance, quietly inspiring others in his community to believe that change was possible, no matter how dire the circumstances. The day Leroy walked into a community center and offered to volunteer his time marked a turning point not only for him, but for countless others. The center, a hub for those struggling with homelessness and unemployment, welcomed him with open arms. Leroy didn't come in with grand speeches or sweeping gestures. He simply offered to help however he could. He swept floors, served meals, and most importantly, listened. His ability to connect with those walking a path he knew intimately became his greatest strength. He didn't offer pity or empty platitudes. Instead, he told his story, the raw truth of it, and showed them that transformation was possible. His words carried the weight of authenticity, and his presence became a quiet beacon of hope for those who had lost their way. One evening, after a particularly busy day at the center, Leroy found himself sitting with a young man named Darnell. Darnell, barely 20, had been living on the streets since he was a teenager. His eyes, filled with defiance and vulnerability, reminded Leroy of his younger self. "I don't see the point," Darnell said, staring at the floor. "You work hard, and then what? Life still knocks you down." Leroy leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on his knees. He had heard those words before, first from his own lips and later from countless others he had met during his journey. "You're right," Leroy said. "Life does knock you down. It knocked me down so many times I lost count. But the point isn't to avoid getting knocked down. The point is to get back up every single time until life doesn't know what to do with you anymore. Darnell looked up, a flicker of curiosity breaking through his hardened exterior. "How do you even start?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Leroy smiled, the memory of his encounter with Jordan flashing in his mind. "You start small," he said. "One step, one decision at a time. You don't have to figure out your whole life in a day. Just figure out tomorrow, and then the day after that." Darnell didn't respond immediately, but Leroy could see the wheels turning in his mind. He didn't push. He had learned that change couldn't be forced. It had to come from within. Over time, Leroy's work at the center grew. What started as a simple act of giving back became a mission. He partnered with local businesses to create job opportunities for those who walked through the center's doors. He organized workshops on resume writing, interview skills, and financial literacy. Slowly but surely, he became a leader in his community, not because he sought the role, but because his actions made it inevitable. One particularly memorable day came when a local news station showed up to cover a job fair Leroy had helped organize. The reporter, a young woman named Vanessa, was captivated by Leroy's story and asked for an interview. At first, Leroy hesitated. He wasn't used to the spotlight and didn't think his story was worth telling. But Vanessa's persistence won him over. During the interview, Vanessa asked, "What drives you to keep doing this work? You've already turned your life around. Why not just focus on your own success?" Leroy's answer was simple but profound. "Because someone gave me a chance when I didn't believe in myself. They didn't just hand me money, they gave me a reason to try. If I can do that for even one person, then it's all worth it." The interview aired a week later, and the response was overwhelming. Donations poured into the community center, and offers of support came from individuals and organizations across the city. Leroy found himself in meetings with business owners, philanthropists, and city officials, all eager to help expand the center's reach. It was a whirlwind of activity, but through it all, Leroy remained grounded, his focus always on the people he was trying to help. One day, as Leroy was sorting through donated clothing at the center, a man in a suit walked in. His presence was commanding, and Leroy recognized him immediately: Michael Jordan. Leroy's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen Jordan since that fateful day on the street corner, and the sudden appearance of the basketball legend felt surreal. Jordan approached Leroy with a warm smile and extended his hand. "I heard about the work you're doing here," he said. "I had to come see it for myself." Leroy shook Jordan's hand, still processing the moment. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice shaky. You changed my life." Jordan chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "No, man, you changed your life. I just gave you a nudge." The two men sat down in the small office at the back of the center where Leroy shared the full story of his journey. Jordan listened intently, nodding occasionally but mostly letting Leroy talk. When Leroy finished, Jordan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You've done something incredible here," Jordan said. "You took a single moment and turned it into something that's changing lives. That's rare, and it's powerful." Jordan's visit didn't end with just words of encouragement. He made a generous donation to the center and offered to help connect Leroy with other resources and opportunities. He also agreed to return for a public event to help raise awareness for the center's mission. The partnership marked a new chapter in Leroy's journey, one that would amplify his impact and reach even more people in need. The event, held in the gymnasium of a local high school, was a resounding success. Hundreds of people attended, drawn by the promise of seeing Michael Jordan and the chance to learn about the center's work. Leroy stood on stage alongside Jordan, sharing his story with a mixture of nerves and pride. The audience hung on his every word, their applause thunderous when he finished. After the event, a young woman approached Leroy with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been struggling to get back on my feet, and hearing your story, it gives me hope." Leroy smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and determination. "That's all it takes," he said, "a little hope." In the years that followed, Leroy's impact continued to grow. He helped expand the community center into a network of facilities across the city, each one dedicated to providing resources and support for those in need. His story became a symbol of what was possible when resilience met opportunity, and his partnership with Jordan remained a cornerstone of his mission. But through all the success, Leroy never forgot where he came from. He often returned to the street corner where he had once begged for $1, not to relive the past, but to remind himself and others that every journey begins with a single step. Standing there, he would sometimes close his eyes and remember the moment that changed everything. The day a man named Michael Jordan didn't just give him $1, but gave him a reason to believe in himself. Leroy's life became a testament to the power of kindness, determination, and the human spirit's ability to overcome even the darkest of circumstances. His story and the countless lives he touched proved that no matter how far you've fallen, it's never too late to rise. The air in the new community center was alive with activity. Volunteers bustled between rooms, setting up tables for an evening skills workshop. Children laughed in the play area while their parents filled out job applications or attended counseling sessions. Leroy walked through the facility, his footsteps echoing lightly on the polished floors. He paused to greet people by name, sharing a kind word or a joke to ease their nerves. It had been years since he first stood on a street corner with nothing but a battered coffee cup, but the memory never faded. Instead, it fueled him. The center had grown exponentially since its early days, thanks in part to the partnership with Michael Jordan. But the expansion wasn't just about physical space, it was about deepening the impact. Leroy had learned that people needed more than just shelter or a meal. They needed tools to rebuild their lives, the belief that they could succeed, and a community that cared. One of the most innovative additions to the center was a mentorship program that paired individuals like Leroy, those who had overcome homelessness, with people just beginning their journey to stability. Leroy had personally mentored dozens of people, but one story stood out, that of Carla, a single mother of two who had come to the center at her breaking point. When Carla first walked through the doors, she was hesitant, her shoulders hunched under the weight of her struggles. Leroy had greeted her warmly, his voice calm and steady. He saw the same look in her eyes that he had once seen in the mirror, exhaustion, fear, and a flicker of hope she was almost too afraid to acknowledge. "I don't know if this can help me," Carla had said during their first meeting. "I've tried everything." Leroy had leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "You don't have to do it all at once," he'd said. "Start with one step. What's one thing you need today to make tomorrow a little better?" Carla had thought for a long moment before answering. "I need a job. I need to feel like I can provide for my kids." Leroy had nodded, his voice firm. "Then let's make that the goal. We'll work on it together." Over the next few months, Carla and Leroy met regularly. He helped her write a resume, practice interview skills, and navigate the often overwhelming process of applying for jobs. When she finally landed a position as an administrative assistant, the joy on her face was indescribable. Leroy had watched as she began to stand taller, her confidence growing with each success. Today, Carla was one of the center's most dedicated volunteers, mentoring others just as Leroy had mentored her. Stories like Carla's were what drove Leroy to keep pushing forward. But with growth came challenges. The increasing demand for the center's services meant more funding was needed, and Leroy found himself in unfamiliar territory, navigating the world of grants, donations, and corporate partnerships. It was a steep learning curve, but Leroy approached it with the same determination that had carried him through his darkest days. One particularly memorable meeting took place in the sleek boardroom of a major corporation. The company's CEO, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Chambers, had invited Leroy to pitch his vision for expanding the center's programs. Leroy had felt out of place in the sterile, high-tech space, but he reminded himself that he was there for a purpose. Evelyn had listened attentively as Leroy spoke, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "You have an incredible story, Mr. Leroy," she said. "But what makes you think this model can work on a larger scale?" Leroy had taken a deep breath, his voice steady as he replied, "Because I've seen it work, one person at a time. When you give people the tools to change their lives and believe in them when no one else does, they rise to the occasion. It's not about throwing money at a problem. It's about creating opportunities and supporting people as they take those opportunities." Evelyn had nodded slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I like the way you think," she'd said. The company became one of the center's biggest supporters, funding a program that provided small grants to individuals starting their own businesses or pursuing education. Another pivotal moment came when Leroy was invited to speak at a national conference on poverty and homelessness. Standing on a stage in front of hundreds of policymakers, nonprofit leaders, and activists, he felt a wave of nerves. But as he began to speak, his passion took over. He shared not just his story, but the stories of the people he'd worked with, their struggles, triumphs, and the lessons they had taught him. "Homelessness isn't just about not having a roof over your head," Leroy said, his voice echoing through the auditorium. "It's about losing a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. And the solution isn't just about housing, it's about rebuilding lives from the inside out." The audience gave him a standing ovation, and afterward, countless people approached him to share how his words had inspired them. Some were leaders of organizations who wanted to implement similar programs, while others were individuals who had experienced homelessness themselves and felt seen for the first time. Back at the center, Leroy continued to focus on the day-to-day work that mattered most. He was often the first to arrive in the morning and the last to leave at night. He knew the names and stories of nearly everyone who walked through the doors, and he made it a point to celebrate their victories, no matter how small. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Leroy sat in his modest office going over plans for an upcoming event. His desk was cluttered with papers, but he didn't mind. The work was a labor of love. As he leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifted to Michael Jordan. They hadn't seen each other in months, but Leroy often reflected on the way that single encounter had set everything in motion. Picking up his phone, Leroy decided to send Jordan a text. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if the basketball icon would even remember him amidst his whirlwind life. But Leroy tapped out a message anyway. "Hi, MJ. I just wanted to say thank you again. The center's thriving, and it's all because of that day you stopped to talk to me. Hope you're doing well." He hit send and went back to his work, not expecting a reply. But a few minutes later, his phone buzzed. The message read, "Leroy, it's great to hear from you. I always knew you'd do something amazing. Keep it up. Let me know if there's ever anything I can do to help." Leroy smiled, a sense of gratitude washing over him. He didn't need anything from Jordan. The man had already done more than enough. But knowing that Jordan still believed in him was a reminder of how far he'd come and how much further he could go. In the years that followed, Leroy's work expanded beyond the city. He began traveling to other communities, sharing his model and helping establish similar centers in areas grappling with homelessness and poverty. He became a sought-after speaker, his name synonymous with resilience and hope. But despite the accolades and the growing recognition, Leroy remained the same humble man who had once stood on a street corner asking for $1. One rainy afternoon, Leroy returned to that very corner. He hadn't been there in years, but he felt drawn to the spot where his journey had begun. As he stood there, watching the rain soak the pavement, a young man approached him, his clothes ragged and his eyes filled with desperation. "Can you spare $1?" the man asked, his voice trembling. Leroy felt a pang of déjà vu. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, just as Jordan had done for him years ago. But before handing it over, Leroy met the man's gaze and said, "I'll give you this on one condition. Promise me you'll use it to take the first step towards something better. It doesn't have to be big, just a step." The young man hesitated, then nodded. "I promise." As the man walked away, clutching the bill, Leroy stood in the rain, a smile tugging at his lips. Life had come full circle, and he was living proof that even the smallest act of kindness could ripple outward, changing lives in ways no one could imagine. The journey was far from over. Leroy knew there were still countless people to help, stories to be written, and lives to be transformed. But as he walked away from that corner, he felt a profound sense of peace. He was no longer a man defined by his past. He was a man creating a future, not just for himself, but for everyone willing to take the first step. As Leroy left the corner where his life had turned years ago, the rain tapered off, leaving behind the scent of wet pavement and a pale, shimmering sunset breaking through the clouds. Each step he took resonated with the sense of a renewed mission. The man he had just helped lingered in his mind, reminding him that the work was never done. It was not a burden, but a purpose, a constant source of energy that kept his soul vibrant. The city felt different to Leroy now, not because its streets had changed, but because he had. The same sidewalks where he had once wandered aimlessly now felt alive with opportunity. Every face he passed held potential, a stranger whose story could be the next one to intersect with his. Leroy no longer felt invisible, and his transformation had taught him one of life's most profound truths. The human spirit thrives on connection and meaning. That evening, he returned to his modest apartment, a space that reflected his new life, simple yet full of character. The walls were adorned with photos of the people whose lives had been transformed through the community center. A young woman in a cap and gown, clutching her diploma. A man standing proudly in front of a food truck he'd launched after receiving support. And a mother holding her children in a room filled with donated furniture that had turned their house into a home. These images weren't just mementos. They were reminders of the ripple effect one act of kindness could create. The next morning, Leroy headed to a local elementary school for a career day event. Invited to speak, he arrived early and took in the cheerful buzz of children running through the halls. As he walked into the gymnasium, he was greeted by a teacher who introduced him to the audience of wide-eyed students. Standing before them, Leroy began, "When I was your age, I didn't think I'd grow up to be anything special. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I didn't think I was good at much. But you know what I learned? It's okay to not have all the answers right away. The most important thing is to keep moving forward, one step at a time." The children listened intently as Leroy shared his journey, omitting none of the hard truths but framing them as lessons that could guide others. His words sparked questions. Eager, curious hands shot into the air. "How did you not give up when things got hard?" one boy asked. Leroy smiled. "Because every time I wanted to give up, someone showed me I didn't have to. Whether it was a small act of kindness or someone believing in me, it reminded me that I could keep going. And now it's my job to remind others of the same thing." After the event, one of the teachers approached him, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for being so honest with the kids," she said. "They need to hear that success isn't just about talent or luck, it's about perseverance." Her words stayed with Leroy as he returned to the center that afternoon. Perseverance had been the cornerstone of his life, and now it was the foundation of his message to the world. He often marveled at how his journey had taken him from surviving to thriving, but he never forgot that it had all started with a question and an unlikely encounter. Later that evening, the center hosted a fundraiser to celebrate its latest milestone, the opening of a satellite location in a nearby city. The room buzzed with excitement as supporters mingled, sharing stories of the center's impact. Leroy stood by the entrance, greeting guests with his characteristic warmth. Among them was a young man who introduced himself as Jamal. "You probably don't remember me," Jamal said, his voice tinged with emotion, "but I came to the center 2 years ago when I had nothing. You sat with me, helped me get a job, and told me I had what it takes to build a better life. Now, I've got my own place and I'm starting a business. I just wanted to say thank you." Leroy shook Jamal's hand, his smile genuine and proud. "I didn't do it for you," he said with a wink. "You did the work. I just reminded you that you could." The fundraiser was a resounding success, raising enough money to fund the satellite location's first year of operations. As the evening wound down, Leroy stood on stage to thank the attendees. Looking out at the crowd, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for what they had achieved, but for the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate more than a building or a program. We celebrate people, their resilience, their courage, and their belief that tomorrow can be better than today. Thank you for helping make this possible, and for being part of a story that's still being written." As the applause swelled, Leroy stepped down from the stage, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The road ahead was long, but he welcomed the challenge. Life, he had learned, wasn't about the destination, but the impact you made along the way. And as long as there were lives to touch, stories to rewrite, and hope to spark, Leroy would continue walking forward, one step at a time. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us. What are your thoughts on Michael Jordan's response to the homeless man? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.